You expected the NPC to underwhelm leading up to this week. Has it, or was there anything that stood out to you?
No, I would agree that it absolutely has underwhelmed. Expectations are always high going into this meeting, at least for the last few years when growth has been under pressure, and usually it's a disappointment. Mainly because this tends to be very high level and also very fiscal oriented. And so there are certain types of things that just don't get discussed at this meeting. And that usually leads to an underwhelming result. But I think in this particular year, given all of the problems that the Chinese economy was facing, I think it was understandable that we were all looking, like Stephen had said, for something meaningful on property, for something meaningful on consumption, and we just didn't get it. What stood out to us the most is that domestic demand, which was at the top of the list for the major priorities last year, has moved down to number 3. And what has moved into numbers 1 and 2 slots are really related to productivity. And you had mentioned the new productive forces. And I think we are starting to really see the government pivot more to a focus on productivity as the avenue for growth. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is we still have a domestic and an external demand problem. And if they're going to be focusing on productivity and industrial policy, we really risk exacerbating this overcapacity issue without having done anything about demand.
Charlene, Steve Engle here. So what should we have heard from leaders about the property market at a time, of course, where the troubles are starting to brew at another developer like Vanke, which is state-backed, is the number 2 developer by sales. We've already seen Evergrande. We've seen Country Garden. Country Garden used to be the bellwether. Now it's no longer, obviously. Vanke seen as the bellwether, but now it's seeing some trouble. What should we have heard from authorities?
So we are still very much in the middle of a collapse in the property sector, and this could still get uglier than it already is. And I think at the moment there's an assumption in the market that the levels of activity have come down so much that things can't get much worse, but that's not really true. What you had just said about Vanke is very important because of the state connections of this firm. Both Country Garden and Evergrande were private companies, and they did not undermine the confidence in state-owned developers. That will be different if we wind up in a situation with Vanke defaulting. I think that could really lead to a loss of confidence in almost every developer in the country if state-owned entities aren't safe. So number one thing that we did not hear on property that would have been very helpful is what is going to be done to stem this continued list of new defaulters every couple of months, because this continues to be a real issue. The second thing we have not heard any meaningful information on is what is going to be done to finish the construction of all of these incomplete units. Now, I know the authorities launched this white list this year, and the hope is that this orientation around getting credit to projects instead of developers might lead to a better outcome. But everything we're hearing so far from banks is that there's still just a trickle of money going toward this. So we still have an issue with millions of Chinese people having bought homes ahead of time that don't have them, who are saddled with double home payments, and that, of course, weighs on consumption. And there's no real solution to that. The other thing is the property bad debt. We have not heard anything about that either.
On consumption, then, how viable is it as a potential engine of growth then for this year, Charlene? I mean, it seems to be a lot of debate on whether China does subscribe or wants to subscribe to some form of welfareism, right? Where a fiscal expansion where you do put into the pockets of households. Is that narrative likely to change? Are they likely to shift that narrative, you think?
So at the moment, Our forecast for retail sales growth this year is 3.7%. That follows 7.2 last year, which was popped up by reopening. I do think, however, given how weak property sales have been in January and February, and how steep some of the price declines continue to be, there's a real potential here that the negative wealth effect continues to deepen and that continues to constrain consumption, and that we actually get disappointment on retail sales. If you look last year and you eliminate those months where there was a base effect from 2022, like a Shanghai lockdown, and you strip out catering and restaurants, which were doing really well last year with reopening, the average monthly year-on-year retail sales growth was just 2.6%. So I do think there is a risk that the consumer is going to even disappoint our pretty weak forecasts here for this year, given the way the property market has started off in January and February.
Well, Charlene, tomorrow I'm coming out with a deeper dive in the consumer. And one thing that really struck a chord with me was the fact that the Ministry of Commerce, essentially their panacea for this problem is to do appliance trade-in program. I mean, that's like not going to do it, is it? It's not going to cut it.
No, it is not. And we've had those kind of programs off and on for about 15 years, and they usually only move the dial to a limited degree. They have talked this time about equipment upgrades, so a similar type of trade-in program, but more for manufacturing equipment. But the companies are going to have the money to even be able to do that to begin with. And I think, the payback from this type of initiatives is going to be very limited. We have really not seen anything done about more fundamental things like building out the social safety net so that households don't feel like they need to save as much as they are. And I think that would go a significant distance in trying to help address some of these consumption problems. And then also the issues that we've got with property that are weighing on confidence.